Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I got connected with an interesting guy. Sean Almeida is his name. He is an entrepreneur, a real estate investor in Kyiv, Ukraine. And, I thought it would be really interesting to connect in with him to find out what's life like in Kyiv, what's business like in Kyiv, what's real estate like in Kyiv in the middle of a war. Sean, welcome to the show. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well, Brian. Thanks for the invite.
So what took you to Kyiv?
So I moved here about 12 years ago. I was living in Moscow before that. And then I just found this very, young, dynamic country, had a lot of opportunities available, I thought. So I moved over here and eventually started my own real estate business. And I've been doing that for the last 10 years.
And tell me about your real estate business, if you could. What do you invest in? What do you do?
So we handle the very center of Kiev, which is a historical center. You have a lot of older buildings from the Tsarist era, from the early Soviet era. And we generally like to attract investors to buy individual apartments. We renovate them and rent them out to other foreigners who work at embassies, international organizations, and things like that. So that's the main focus.
It's a beautiful downtown core. Has it been destroyed by the war?
No, not at all. I mean, there's been a couple of strikes a couple of kilometers away, and I live on the top floor of a building, and I have really good view, and I can see some stuff going on some nights. But overall, last time you and I talked, I think was back in May. It's become much quieter since then because of all the air defense that the West had donated. It's become a very protected city. So Russia doesn't really strike that often, and when they do, we feel pretty protected. But yeah, so in general, the physical the destruction in the center has been basically zero.
So tell me what life is like. Do you go to restaurants? Do you have to go to a bomb shelter? Do you have to, have a whole bunch of canned goods in your basement? Like, what do you have to do? I don't think anyone can imagine what it's like living through and being in a war zone.
Yeah, in general, it's pretty surreal. So a year ago, the winter was pretty tough because Russians were attacking the electricity infrastructure, the heating infrastructure. So if you were on a higher floor, you couldn't take the lift because they might cut off electricity while you're in the lift and you might get stuck in there. So you had to walk up. Water quality was pretty bad. Generally, the supplies of everything was fine, but this winter was actually much easier again because of the air defenses. So everything's open. I mean, if there is an attack or an alarm, there's plenty of restaurants and stuff, or metro stations where you can go underground to be safe. In general, today it's a gorgeous, gorgeous spring day. It's a bit chilly, but it's just sunny and everyone's out, everyone's walking around. I mean, the war is never far. We do construction as well, renovations, and one of our guys was just buried yesterday. He was killed over a year ago in Donbass area, and they found his body luckily. And so all our workers who knew him and worked with them took off the day to go to his funeral. So like stuff like that, it's always there. But in terms of like the kinetic, physical, are there bombs falling every day in Kiev? No. And again, that's thanks to the massive air defenses that the West, especially the Patriot system, that have been donated. So that's the surreal part, that you kind of walk around and it's a nice European city and the war is just humming in the background.
The war is humming in the background. That's incredible that you just keep on operating in business and running your life.
Yeah, I mean, we work with mostly foreigners, so things were bad at the beginning of the war and everything. But basically, a lot of organizations, Red Cross, the USAID projects, other embassies, they added a lot of personnel, and so our tenant base is wider than it was before the war in general. So, and it's mostly single people. No families are arriving, so that's allowed me to continue to live here and grow my business back up. And we still have investors who are buying properties, who are renovating them to rent out to the foreigners. So people really believe in the story. People who have lived here, a foreigner who's never been here, we're probably not going to come and invest that much. Those who knew before and know how it works and see how my business works, they believe in the story. So overall, there's kind of a general optimism, that Kiev is not just going to survive, but do well in the future.
You wrote an article about unlocking the value trapped in Kiev's historical buildings.
Yeah, that's true. It was relevant before the war, and it's still relevant now. These buildings, they've been neglected. So they're solid, thick walls, high ceilings. They're great properties, beautiful buildings, but they've been neglected. And so our investors, what I focus on is taking them and renovating them and finding ways to add value. And then you can rent them out for really good prices that people are really surprised at the rents you can get. It's a supply and demand issue. There's just not enough good housing in the center.
So what kind of a return might one get if they invested in an old building in downtown Kyiv?
Yeah, our average is probably around 10%. We've had some be higher, but maybe outliers. But done right, again, it's so they say location, location, location. That is true, but it also you need to really know the nuances. Like if there's a hill, like expats who pay good money do not want to walk down up and down a hill every day to go to work, for example. So you need to know where your target audience is, where the embassies are, where the business centers are, and then the buildings themselves. If the street's loud outside, so if you know what you're looking at, 10% is not hard to achieve. And that's just the rental yield. And if you look at real estate prices totally, it's lower than anything else anywhere else in Europe by far. Especially talking about a bigger city. I mean, it could be 2 or 3 times cheaper than some other capitals in Europe. So
now the key to investing successfully in real estate here in Toronto would be able to raise debt. 50 to 65% of the value in debt against the building. Can you raise debt against a building in Kyiv?
So not really. I mean, there are mortgages sometimes, but they're limited in size, and also the interest rate is around 20% because they would be based on the local currency. Most of our buyers so far have been all cash buyers. Generally people who've done fairly well and they can afford to spend $200,000-$300,000 in cash. A few have bought multiple places, so again, it's kind of limited. Locals can also buy, but again, you kind of one and done. Usually, you have the cash, you buy a place, and that's all your cash is in the property. But Ukrainians don't like holding cash. They don't like banks. They don't trust banks. So if they have $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 that they've made, they're going to put it into real estate in some form or another.
Incredible that you're there in Kyiv, that you're living your life, that you're running your business, and you're incredibly optimistic. You about a week ago did a really interesting video on the 2-year anniversary of the invasion. And I'm going to take a break for some messages. And when we come back, I'm going to ask you about that video that you did, why'd you do it, and what you think about the 2-year anniversary and where Ukraine is right now. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with Sean Almeida, real estate investor, owner, CEO of his company in Kyiv, Ukraine. Incredible. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Sean Almeida. He's the Chief Executive Officer at Vester Estate, which is a real estate company in Kyiv, Ukraine. It's hard to believe that, I guess, business has to go on, life has to go on, but I think everyone finds it a little bit astounding that you can still invest in and make money in real estate in the middle of a war. Maybe it's because of the air defense systems. It'd be a lot more challenging if those air defense systems weren't there, I guess. But congratulations to you. I got to ask you, you've had, it looks like a 10-year, if not more, experience in real estate. But before that, you were in the Marines. What the Russians and Ukrainians think about a former staff sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps coming to town, and I would have thought some people were going to be wondering if you're a spy or something like that. Like, what's the reaction to you, buddy?
Yeah, definitely, and more. I lived in Russia before, again, for a couple of years. Definitely more there. They have this thing. They think it's like Tom Clancy, where if you're a Marine and you speak Russian, you must be a spy. And then I came here. There was some jokes about that as well, but. Well, ironically, when I was bad at Russian, they thought I was a spy. When I got good at Russian, then they thought I was one of theirs. You're like, oh, you're one of us, basically. So it's kind of ironical that they think if you get good at Russian, then you're not really a spy anymore. So I don't really hear those jokes anymore. And then people know me. Yeah, at the beginning, people just think it's weird. And they listen to my story and they go, oh, you have your own business here. That's different than just coming here and trying to live like, get a job, getting Ukrainian salaries. So yeah, in that sense, a bit surprising at first, but when people hear the full story, it makes sense to them.
You've got a master's in international affairs from Columbia.
Yeah, that's true. And I focused on the former Soviet region, and I was really interested in energy policy, actually. So yeah, I didn't plan to get into real estate, but when I was living in Moscow, I worked at a bank, and I just found out that real estate here really needed a lot of development in the residential side. So commercial side is very developed, the malls and all the retail stuff. That's all very developed on an international level. But residential, especially the historical center, I felt was neglected, saw an opportunity, and so I went for it.
About a week ago, you posted a really poignant video on LinkedIn, I guess, on social media, and it was a sunny winter update ahead of the 2-year anniversary of the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And you talked about life on the streets, and you were out on the street when you were doing this video, and you got quite a big response to that video on social media. Tell me why you did the video. What is it that you said, and why did you want to convey this message?
Yeah, so I've been doing these videos on and off throughout, giving updates. Sometimes I'm targeting maybe more my investors or other things. Sometimes just want to show people that Kiev is still a functioning city, that it's not maybe as bad as they might assume. Also, the 2-year anniversary, President Zelensky had reposted something, kind of a meme that he had posted right after the war, when the Russians said, "Oh, Zelensky ran away, all the government ran away," trying to using propaganda to think, make Ukrainians think the president ran away. So he posted a thing saying, we're still here. And he reposted 2-year anniversary saying, we are still here. And I want to show people too that those of us who live in Kiev, who love the place, my daughter was born here. So it's not just a place that I randomly passing through, that, we are still here. I mean, it's very unpleasant. And of course, again, with the war in the background and, people we know that are getting wounded and killed. But in the end of the day, Russia hasn't even come close to kind of breaking the spirit of this place.
Kyiv is one thing, and I guess you've got your air defenses there, and it's I've done business in Kyiv myself, and it really is a beautiful city. But what about cities more to the east?
Yeah, definitely struggles. Much closer. You have much less time to respond to the air attacks, and there's more weapons they have that can reach those cities. So definitely for me, business-wise, I don't think I would have anything there, at least not what I do. Again, and also being the capital, we have a lot more of a client base. It just seems overall that, especially Kharkiv, I think the Russians really think it's their city that they're going to try to take back. It seems like that's kind of a medium-term goal. But ironically, with the Russians, what they do mostly, they say something, "This is our city," and then they bomb it and destroy it. And even when they get some towns back, or not back, but when they claim some towns, they say they like proud of their success, and all you see is smoldering ruins. This is like what Russia has planned for whatever they want to capture. So luckily, the front line is about 500 kilometers, 300 miles away from here. So that makes my business able to function.
The cost of rebuilding, whether Russia's successful or Ukraine's successful, the cost of rebuilding those towns is going to be astronomical, is it not?
Yeah, I think a lot of the smaller towns probably will not get rebuilt. I think they're too covered in unexploded ordnance and things like that. Also, they weren't really that good at being economically feasible on their own. They were kind of built during Soviet times, maybe for mines, maybe for some other kind of thing that isn't really relevant anymore. So I think I tell people I think it'll be more like an offshore kind of oil derrick. Think about that. That these places, they have a lot of valuable resources still there in terms of mining, things like that. But it'll probably be kind of rotations, bring guys in to work at camps for 6 weeks and go back home for 2 weeks. Like I just can't imagine bringing families over there with the unexploded ordnance and other stuff that's happened there. So I think whatever happens, a lot of the towns there won't look the same. The big cities, I think, will still be there. They've been there for a long time for a reason. But the smaller stuff you see that's turned to rubble, it won't make any sense to rebuild exactly there. I mean, they'll have to build housing for the displaced and those who will come back after the war from Europe, but I don't think it'll look the same after in those places.
Are the mines operational? Are some of those industrial activities still operating?
Yeah, I mean, Russia captured them even in the first phase of the war before the full-scale invasion. So yeah, not at full industrial level, because obviously you need massive investment to kind of mine at a proper level. But smaller level stuff, and Russia's stealing, precious resources that they mine out. They steal food from Ukraine and send it to Russia to sell on their markets there. So a lot of it's being stolen, unfortunately. But so it's not really at a full industrial scale. But after the war, and Ukraine takes back all this territory, you'll see that there's so much stuff under the ground that hasn't been tapped at all. Oil and gas, especially. Oil and gas hasn't been developed in Ukraine basically since 1970s, and there's quite a good potential, at least, to be self-sufficient. But again, that's going to require massive investment after the war.
I didn't realize that. I knew that there was a fair amount of mining, but I didn't realize there was oil and gas. Is it? Why wasn't it exploited?
Russia is an empire. People tend to forget that or think it's just a word, like literally an empire. So all the oil and gas pipelines and even rail started in Moscow and go out. And so they didn't want Ukraine to develop their own, because they wanted to be a transit point and they wanted to be further away from from the West. They didn't want the oil fields that are functioning and gas fields functioning, things like that. So they had so much gas in other parts of Russia, deeper into Russia, that they didn't feel the need, and all the export pipelines would go again from the center of Russia through Ukraine, for example, into Europe. So even after 2014, when the conflict started, and they started to kind of ban imports from Russia into Ukraine, trying to strangle Ukraine, right? We have control over you. You can't get oil and gas. They actually reversed some of the pipelines so that Russian gas would get sold to Hungary or somewhere, and then they would send it back in from Europe into Ukraine, the Russian gas, because Russia wouldn't sell it directly to Ukraine. So yeah, the imperial game they played, it obstructs a lot of, I think, a lot of development.
I've been amazed that the Ukrainian railways have continued to operate and so successfully even after bombings. What's the secret there?
I think redundancy. There's so many different rails. You can bomb a rail line, but it's really easy to fix a rail line, and there's so many different layers with electricity. Even electrical nodes that control the rail. They're hard to kind of knock out. You might knock out a line. It takes a couple of days, couple of weeks to repair. Other lines are working. Also, with the European partners, with there's 4 or 5 countries that we border on the west, and so they're also improving their rail connections to Ukraine, reviving old lines that hadn't been used in decades. And it's only going to get better because the gauges in Ukraine and Europe don't match. They have to change the gauge. The width of the track is different. So even with Ukraine and Poland, which has a long history together, the rails are actually different. So usually you have to stop, expand, or contract the rail width, and then ship further. So now they're trying to do it where the two systems match up better in order to get rid of that delay.
I didn't know that, and I presume the gauges between Ukraine and Russia are the same.
They are the same. Again, it's imperial thing, so yeah, they are the same.
We're chatting tonight with Sean Almeida, who is a real estate investor, CEO of his own real estate company in Kyiv, Ukraine. And we're chatting about what his business is like, what entrepreneurship is like, what business is like, what real estate is like in the middle of a city at war. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes after messages. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Sean Almeida. He is a CEO of a company, Vector Real Estate, in Kyiv, Ukraine, where he buys old Ukrainian buildings and fixes them up and rents them out and makes good money at it. Sean, I got to take a step back. You've got a master's in international policy. You've been a Marine. You've lived and worked in the United States, in Moscow, in Kyiv. Like, you've got to be able to do business anywhere in the world. You speak Russian. I presume you speak Ukrainian. You speak English. Why are you still in Kyiv in the middle of a war?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think people who come here for a while, they kind of see that it's not crazy. That the quality of life, even during this time, is really nice in Kyiv. And I tell people too. I lived everywhere. I lived in Florida. I lived in Vienna. I lived in quite in the U.S. 2 different places. And I didn't. So before I moved to Kyiv 12 years ago, I didn't live anywhere more than 2 years for 14 years. So from high school until I moved to Kyiv, I didn't live anywhere more than 2 years. So when I came here, I just really like the vibe. It's always changing. It's always developing. Even during a war, I have my own business, and there's a lot of parks. There's a river. There's some beaches on the river. It's a very, very, very pleasant city. It's a great walking city. I like to walk. I don't like to drive or take a taxi or anything like that. So it's just a really nice city, and people have an impression of it sometimes before they come here that it's, I don't know, some kind of smoky smokestacks and Chernobyl and all these like kind of negative associations. But I think anyone like you've been here and that it's just a beautiful little city, and it just keeps changing and improving. If it stopped improving or got worse or something, I'd have to think about where I want to live. But I mean, for me personally, I love it here. I really do.
I used to go to the Opera House right downtown. Is it reopened?
Yeah, they've been open probably about a year and constantly having shows. Mozart's Requiem was the show they put on for the 2-year anniversary. So yeah, functioning very well.
There was a hockey arena just, I think, to the west of downtown, where I went to see Bryan Adams, a Canadian rock star, when I was there once.
Of course.
Do you get concerts coming to Kyiv?
Not big ones. There's maybe been some smaller the venues. We haven't been allowed to even go to. So they have football matches, but they don't allow audiences to show up. no fans allowed to go. So they'll have the games during the season. Rumors are they might allow to have some fans show up at some games now. We'll see if that comes. I hope so. I mean, I'm not a huge football fan, but my local friends generally are, and so we like to go watch the Kiev Dynamo team.
There was a incredible, wonderful dining shopping strip that was just south of the main square. That was sort of old city, tiny streets, lots of bars and restaurants. Is that a lot?
Yeah, I think you talk about Podol region. Podil is the neighborhood. Yeah, it's like the old town. Yeah, it's doing very well. It has this very creative vibe to it. The word hipster gets thrown around probably too much. I don't like to offend anyone. They're not all hipsters, but yeah, it's a very, very creative, artistic area. So there's a very good vibe there. Other parts of the city too. They also refurbished a couple of what do you call it? The arsenal, like an old arsenal building that was part of the Tsarist, the military infrastructure. They've converted it into like a restaurant kind of food market thing where you walk in and it's got 20 different restaurants and bars in one space, music venues. So yeah, I mean, more or less, the Kiev is functioning very well. At least in the center. Outside the center, it can be a bit different. It can be a bit quieter. Places, a lot of businesses have suffered, obviously. But the downtown is still very, very vibrant, I would say.
When I was there was almost a competition between I think it was the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Catholic Church for the grandeur of the churches and the people that went to the different churches. Where's religion right now in Kyiv?
Yeah, I don't think that's changed much. I mean, there's definitely a pretty solid Catholic minority in Kiev. There's no kind of animosity or any kind of I don't really see anything like that. The only thing that's changed, it's kind of a nuance that gets lost and used as propaganda on the Russian side, is that part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church had Moscow management, and then there's the Kiev management. And so they basically forced a couple of the physical churches to hand over management to the Kiev Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so the Russian Orthodox Church management it's Ukrainian Orthodox Church with Russian management. They got booted out. It sounds a bit confusing. It's just kind of management thing because the head of it is a KGB, literally a former KGB spy. And so when they kicked him out, the Russians started saying that the Zelensky and the Ukrainians are trying to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and it's just not true at all. Anyone who says that is either ignorant or playing along with the propaganda. It's not the case at all. So
I was in Kyiv doing business in 2007, 2008, 2009. And at that time, there really were, a lot of people that were Russian speaking and were introducing me to Russian banks and Russian investors. There were a lot of Russian people in town that were, bringing Russian money and investing in it in Ukraine. And then there was a whole other sort of sector that was European focused. They tended to speak Ukrainian. They went to different restaurants. They wanted me to do business with German banks and things like that. But everyone got along. And, I understand, I don't know if you know this, but there's something like 1 in 4 Canadians has a blood relative in the United States. So that we had this, we have this pretty close relationship with, American family and friends. And I understood that Ukraine was similar, that 1 in 4 or something like that, Ukrainians had blood relatives across the border in Russia. What's happened to all that? The business interaction and the family interaction when you've crossed the border so close?
Yeah, Kiev definitely had a stronger Russian influence than Western Ukrainian cities. The linguistic thing doesn't really show what people's loyalties are. It didn't then, and it doesn't really now. There's a lot of Russians. There's a lot of soldiers and Ukrainian army soldiers out there on the front lines. I watch the videos. They speak Russian, and they're out there fighting against the Russians. A lot of people here in terms of family. Yeah, a lot of people. Of course, I have tons of friends who have family there, and a lot of times, unfortunately, they can't even talk to them anymore. They say, "No, you're falling." The Russians will tell the Ukrainians, "You're falling for Nazi propaganda. We're fighting just to protect ourselves against you, and the bombs are not falling on your city." They just say the most absurd things, and so a lot of people basically don't talk to relatives anymore in Russia. Yeah, it's very sad to see. It's crazy. And I moved here in 2012. Yeah, there was no tension. It was almost like moving from Moscow to Kiev was at the time moving like from New York to Boston or something. It was just a lot of similarities, and But then as I got here, I started learning different things that they do think very differently. They don't have this imperial mentality, which I like. I don't like the imperial mentality that some countries have. Kiev has never been the head of a capital, so. But the Russians started saying, "Oh, you get a little big for your britches. What do you think? What do you think you're going to do? Go to the West? No, you're one of us." And Ukrainians, kind of this Ukrainian mentality spread throughout the country pretty strongly. And then when they were attacked and Crimea happened, it got stronger. And so, since the full scale invasion, yeah, I do speak fluent Russian. My Ukrainian is getting better every day. I understand quite well. You kind of have to know both languages in the city. Everywhere now, if I go to a restaurant, they'll never speak to me in Russian at the restaurant anymore. Before they would. So now maybe I answer in Russian, and they're gonna keep speaking Ukrainian. And I have Ukrainian speaking friends who are glad that there's more Ukrainian. But at the same time, on social settings, people are gonna go back to their native language, whatever they feel like speaking. I mean, there's no reason to walk around the city speaking Ukrainian if you're more of a Russian speaker. I mean, as a local, I mean. And so you kind of need to know both languages to kind of function properly, which it can be kind of frustrating. People, they ask me, what should I start studying? I said, I guess start with Ukrainian, but I mean, a lot of cases, especially talking about older people who are 40 and 50, 60, they might not be able to speak Ukrainian very well. And so for younger generations, definitely Ukrainian, but it's going to be hard to just have the one. So it's really complex. And I don't know how it's going to develop. I assume it's going to keep going with more Ukrainian. My daughter speaks Ukrainian understands more Ukrainian than Russian, but the Russian is still there too, even though she's only 3.5.
Oh, really? What about
Mhm.
what about the banks? Half the banks I met were Russian banks. I presume they've all left town. But what happened to all their employees? A bunch of the companies I met were owned by Russians or had Russian investment. I presume that's left town. So what's happened from a business standpoint?
Yeah, a lot of them got squeezed out, pushed out. The bank I worked for, they had a branch in Ukraine, and probably around 2015 already, like not long after the initial invasion of Crimea and all that. The Ukrainian government just squeezed them. They weren't allowed to repay the debt back to Russia that they owed, and so their funding dried up, and they just went under. Other banks might have just sold to locals and kind of more civilly pulled out of the market. Other companies, yeah, either you had to sell your asset or give up your Russian passport, maybe, so it's kind of across the board. But in general, Russian business is almost zero. And unfortunately, there's been some Russians who've lived here a long time, who are very loyal to Ukraine, who ended up kind of stuck in the middle where they didn't get a Ukrainian passport, but they've been here 15 years. They have a property here, and they're not squeezed out of their property. No one's seizing, private assets from individuals, really, unless they're proved to be a traitor or collaborator or something. But yeah, they've had a hard time, administratively or crossing the border. They might have their family here and their property, but if they go to Europe, then every time they get to the border, they're getting interrogated, like, oh, you're Russian, blah blah. Even if they speak Ukrainian very fluently, so yeah, it's tough for Russians in this part of the world. I'll tell you right now, nothing's easy. It's a real war. Ukrainians are very, very upset with Russians. There's no just like, oh, we understand it's not you. Like, this is a full scale invasion. It's existential for Ukrainians, and so they've used all means at all levels to push out Russian influence.
John, it's been 2 years. The news that we hear is that that Russia is on the advance, taking over some small towns. That the United States, particularly, but the West, isn't arming Ukraine to the extent that it needs, being held up by the Congress in the United States right now. What's your prognosis?
Yeah, I think the US aid will pass, and I think the Europeans are figuring out not to rely too much on the US and actually get your own production, because they've neglected production for so long. So I think even in the short run, it's going to kind of smooth itself out in terms of deliveries. It's a bit exasperating. People are just going, what's going on? Why is this guy in Congress blocking us? But internal politics is always going to play a role. There's been some frustration on the Polish border. The Polish farmers have been blocking the border because the exports, the grain exports that might have gone by ship before are going by train, and it's kind of crashing the markets a little bit in Poland, for example, because they're the main transit country. So they're frustrated. So internal politics is pretty frustrating. I don't think there's any desperation, like everything's going to collapse. I think but they're also drafting a lot of guys. A lot of my friends of mine who might not have expected to be drafted a year ago, or kind of expecting to be called up, or just going ahead and saying, okay, I'm going to sign up now and try to get a position I want rather than getting drafted later. Yeah, so it's having an impact. I mean, but I think compared to a year ago, even probably when we talked last, there was more optimism a year ago that maybe this year, maybe in 6 months, the war will end. I think what's happened over the last 6 months is that people have resigned themselves. In fact, this is going to be a long war. There's no silver bullet. The F-16s will not end the war. The ammunition, when it gets flowing again, will not end the war. So people have resigned themselves to a long war, not because they want a war, it's because they don't see any other option. I will talk about peace talks. Like, no one thinks that any peace talks with Russia now would make any sense. There's no way. They don't see any way to end the war and to guarantee themselves a safe future. So ending the war could end the conflict or the fighting right now, but it just means Russia gears up for the next round. They waited 8 years between rounds of invasions before, and it might be even 3 or 4 years for the next invasion. Ukraine feels very vulnerable that if they don't fight, then they cease to exist. That's a real feeling people have here because of the way Russia behaves, and they just, they don't want to live under the Russian boot. That's just the hardcore fact, and that's why, at the end of the day, that's why they're fighting. So prognosis militarily is things won't collapse, but it's not the case where people see the end of the light either, which is it's a very bad feeling. I'll say that, but when there's no alternative, then you just have to keep going on and keep pressing on and hoping that things take a turn for the best.
Donald Trump, who is the leading candidate right now to be the Republican candidate for president, and some polls, lots of polls, show that he actually is the leading candidate to be the next president of the United States, has said that he could end the war in a day. And some people think that that's because he would give up or force Ukraine and Zelensky to give up all the land that Russia has taken so far. What do you think of that prospect?
Yeah, obviously it doesn't sound realistic. I'm not one to take all of his statements at face value. Ending the war in one day, I don't know, unless he threatens to nuke Moscow or something like that. I don't see that as being, because it's not just a ceasefire right on current lines. Russia, officially took in these 4 regions in the east and south into Russia. They don't control 3 of those, at least a significant portion of 3 of those regions. So for them to say, okay, we'll go to a ceasefire, they're admitting that Ukraine basically occupies part of their regions, right? That's the logic here. Like Ukraine says they're occupying half of one of the regions, and Russia, the war ended. Russia's going to say, wait, we can't stop here because now Ukraine is occupying our territory officially. So that's a sticking point. Like, I don't think either side is willing or able to really stop the war in a plausible way. I mean, of course, Russia could tell their people back home, oh, the war is over. We never wanted those lands, or something, But in general, it's a real sticking point. So whatever Trump says, there's a reality on the ground here that even he can't change. Although, I mean, he makes people nervous here. People read the news and they think that he'll come and just sell out Ukraine or just stop deliveries of weapons overall, which will not end the war. A lot of people think, if we just stop sending the guns, that the war will end. That is not what will happen. It'll get nastier, I would say. But there's no ending a war that easily in any case, in any situation.
Nikki Haley, who is the only remaining candidate other than Trump in the Republican primary, says if we give up on Ukraine, Putin will go to Poland and the Baltics next. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe not Poland right away. Poland's arming themselves at the teeth because they know Baltics is always a threat. It's very hard for NATO to defend the Baltics, actually, given the location. If Russia pushes it. But if you look at the southern part, next would probably be Moldova, because in the southern part of Ukraine, if they got Odessa, for example, Odessa is a short drive to Moldova. And you have already this occupied land in Moldova, Transnistria, that the Russians have occupied since the end of the Soviet Union. So yeah, I think they would push. I think there's too much of a military machine they've built up, and if it's still strong enough, then why wouldn't they push more? I mean, they got Ukraine against our wishes, against our support. Taking over Moldova, which is not NATO, would be easy. Baltics, they could push over there, and NATO. I think in general, the West is not really taking the thing seriously. I think Eastern European countries are taking it very seriously. Poland's buying like 1,200 new tanks. All kinds of artillery systems. They're buying a bunch of HIMARS. They're taking it very seriously. Baltics doesn't really have the industrial base to do such, the size of the economy, but they are taking the threat very seriously. I think in the West, I think they're, people in the government, in the even military, they're going home at 5 p.m., right? The whistle blows, they're going home at 5 p.m. Russia is running 3 shifts a day, building all this war material, regrowing other things that they, artillery production that they haven't done for a while. And now they're up to probably over 1 million per year, 2 million, maybe 2 million per year. So Russia is on war footing, and the West is completely, I think, sleepwalking into something much bigger, for sure.
So if you could speak to, to an American audience right now, what would you tell them?
I say we need to get on war footing, and it's not just about Ukraine because I live here and I'll come save my country I live in. I take responsibility for where I've chosen to live, but looking at a bigger picture, when you see the Middle East, there's the constant threat in East Asia of something happening in the Pacific, right? So we're not on the footing to deal with a larger problem. And also look at Iran and North Korea are arming Russia. And in the West, they're like, well, we don't want to escalate. Well, I'm sorry, but Russia's escalating by bringing in 2 other, countries that we have problems with, at least to arm themselves with ballistic missiles that can attack a European country right under the noses. And everyone back home is, again, working till 5 p.m. and calling it a day. I think there's still a very small minority of people who actually see the larger threat. And getting on war footing doesn't mean a bigger war. It might mean averting a larger war. When people say, oh, the U.S. woke up early, for example, the industry in Europe woke up early and now they're armed to the teeth. Let's maybe not push all these little buttons, but if the West just keeps on the same footing we're on now, it's not this conflict. There's going to be more and more conflict, I think, around the world, looking at the bigger picture. So, as a Marine, it's really frustrating to see that we're not doing what we can to really get prepared for something larger. And I don't have a good feeling in general about the next 10 years around the world because mainly I would say American weakness is the biggest thing. It's not all on our shoulders. We have allies, but I think we're not leading the way in terms of getting on war footing and preparing. Peace through strength I think is still a very valid concept, but sitting there waiting for the war to happen and then building up like we did in 1941, I think it's just a big mistake.
Sean Almeida, thanks so much. Peace through strength. Get on a war footing so that you can alleviate a war. I agree with you completely. I really appreciate your comments, and I appreciate you sharing with us what's it like to live and work and run a business in the middle of Kiev, Ukraine during the war. Thanks so much for joining us.
Okay. Thanks, Brian, for having me again. Cheers.
We're going to take a break for some messages, and I'm going to come back with my own thoughts on particularly on what Sean's saying about this issue in regards to getting on a war footing right now so we can alleviate something that could be far worse in the future. Stay with us, everyone. Sean, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian.